Awesome, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. So the kind of like big question I want to talk about today is basically, marketing evolution is a media measurement product. How would you use one of these things to drive revenue growth? I think most marketers care a lot about measuring the effectiveness of their media, and we think about this a lot, obviously, so we have some thoughts and opinions. But real quick, just to say who we are, I'm Basil. I've been in and around marketing for my whole career, which such as it is. I started out as an analyst, in marketing organizations, trying to drive users and growth and that kind of thing. I've been on the analyst side within media measurement providers, trying to drive adoption and help people understand what's going on with their marketing. I've been kind of a consultant, basically building custom AI solutions for all kinds of different companies. And now I'm on the product side in a media measurement company, Marketing Evolution, trying to build products that help people use these kinds of models and tools. So that's me. Imran, would love to hear from you as well.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning for some of you. My name is Imran. I play the role of a solutions architect at Marketing Evolution, based in Brooklyn, New York. Been in my role for about 2 years. My primary function is to help our current advertising clients and prospective clients visualize how their business questions can be addressed through our software platform. I've come with sort of a wealth of experience in the measurement side of things. Had a chance to work with global clients, people like Danish brewers using MMM to sell more beer to Malaysians, as well as CPG majors trying to get Brooklyn hipsters to shave their beards, unsuccessfully though. The common thread has been that I've always enjoyed being a conduit between marketers and their two most important constituents, their consumers and their CFO. And I'm excited to show you how our framework enables you to do both using our platform. Over to you, Basil.
Okay, so how do we test and learn to growth? Well, it's super easy. All you have to do is collect and validate your data set. You need to understand it with both human and machine intelligence. You need to validate the insights that come out of that understanding and then activate them in the marketplace. And then look at what you did in the future and see how it worked and kind of cycle from there. Obviously, I'm sort of joking here a little bit. It's not easy, right? We don't do this very much. In my career, at every step, I've struggled to have this happen, right? I ask myself this every day, like, why aren't we doing this more? Why don't we do this virtuous cycle of learning by doing, right? Of taking data, understanding it with our machine intelligence, doing stuff with it, seeing how it worked, and starting over. What stops us? So, when I was an analyst, the very beginning of my career, I was being asked really hard questions that I couldn't answer, right? Without more data, without going back to school and becoming a data scientist. And, when I was trying to drive adoption of these tools, I was trying to design experiments and work with marketers and help them, feel comfortable with the results they were seeing. As an AI consultant building these AI tools, literally we would work with our partners and, build them something custom. Like we picked the design of the application just for them, right? Their model, they're happy with it, and then still really struggled to drive adoption of those tools we're building. And now I think of this from a kind of more a product perspective of how do I design the software itself with my team, obviously, so that it kind of brings out this kind of behavior naturally of experimenting, learning by doing. And I think this place where we tend to get stuck actually is not in this cycle of learning by doing. It's in just trusting the outputs of the process. So this validation step, right, where you spend a bunch of time, you collect a bunch of data, you run it through some kind of tech stack, and you get an output, and then we just stop. We get stuck in the mud, and we talk and we talk and we talk and we do. So what do we do normally in this validation process? So traditionally, we do one of two things. You do sort of a methodology review. I call this the math fight, right? We get in a conference room or a Zoom call now, and we have two teams, and we pile math on each other, and eventually one team says uncle, you give up, and you move on with your lives. Or we try and do some kind of experiment, which is trying to be test and learn, right? So we might do a holdout test or an A/B test or a blackout period, something like this. And we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and we don't really get anywhere, right? So how do we get stuck? What gets us stuck? I think there's three things. First, this math fight doesn't ever convince anyone, right? We end up maybe with an armistice, right? Maybe everything's okay for a couple of months, and then, I don't know, a retargeting touch point shows up before a prospecting touch point, and we all get back around the conference table and start fighting again, right? It's just sort of a ongoing, never-ending process. The experiments themselves are quite difficult to run, and they're quite sometimes inconclusive, right? So only certain kinds of media even make sense to run these kinds of experiments. It's really difficult to control for all the confounding effects in the marketplace. As we obviously just experienced a black swan, or still experiencing a black swan event, but even stuff like viewability and the inherent bias of the targeting platforms themselves makes it really hard to actually even run like a clean A/B test. And it's just sort of this process where you're like realize that you're sort of spending money unproductively on purpose to maybe find out something, and it just feels sticky. And I think the last thing, this is really important, is that marketing and media response are really dynamic and they're inherently unstable, right? This isn't just like a data modeling exercise. We aren't just saying, hey, what was the impact of oil prices on the economy in 1970? And that data set stays the same, and we just noodle on it and we run a bunch of tests and we think about it, right? That's a different kind of process. Marketing, there's always new platforms popping up, right? Like TikTok or whatever's next. Consumers are always changing their tastes. We always ourselves have new products to sell, and we want to sell them to new kinds of people. And we know that creatives and products both kind of get stale, right? That's why the cars change a little bit every year, because we know that if we just keep selling the same thing, it's not going to work. If we keep using the same creatives, they're not going to work. So even if I got a super great measurement of my particular creative, in June of last year, who cares, right? It's already too late to reuse. But I think the most important thing is we're not actually asking the right question when we do this kind of validation process. So, this is, I think, a really important question, right? Why should a marketer care about the accuracy of the coefficient estimates within their model, within their intelligence process, right? If I go to my CFO and they ask me, hey, we made a big investment in media measurement last year, like, how's that process coming along? And we say to them, oh, it's going great, right? We did implementation, we got all the data in order, and I'm like 98% sure that the display tactic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 has a coefficient of 1.3. The CFO is going to look at me like my, got an arm coming out of my head. Like, that's not the language they're talking, right? The CFO cares about one thing and one thing only, and that's revenue and maybe margin, right? So we need to talk in that language too when we talk about validation. The objective of the marketer is not to measure media effectiveness. It is to drive revenue growth. So when we validate this process, we should not be validating the outputs and the process, the methodology and all that stuff. We should be validating the ability to drive revenue growth with the product, right? So that's how I think about it as a product person. The product needs to drive revenue growth. That's the objective of the marketer. That's the objective of the CFO. That's my objective when I'm designing the product, to help other people drive revenue growth. Okay, so how do we do this in other places, right? We must do this in other parts of our life because AI is all around us. So what are some examples of the AI that we use every day without even questioning, right? We all use Google Maps, or most of us use Google Maps to get around. Many of us have Alexas that we talk to, and we believe the responses that come back. Outlook is constantly telling me my grammar is bad. I have a lot of cookbooks, right? Cookbook recipe is basically an algorithm. I trust them. I use them all the time. I have a kind of a mental mapping and schematic of how other drivers on the road will behave, right? So I trust their signals and I don't, or maybe that person isn't going to use their signal. I can tell because they're accelerating quickly. There's all sorts of places where we validate models, and we do this sort of automatically. Right? We don't really think about it. But what are we doing when we evaluate those kinds of models? Well, I think we're doing two things. We're asking two really important questions. Is the representation of the world close enough to the real world to be usable? And the prediction that this algorithm, this intelligence is making, how close is it to what actually happens in the world? So if I were to map these questions to a couple examples here, for Google Maps, does it know the rules of the road that I'm driving on, right? Is it sending me down a one-way street the wrong way? Is it saying, hey, make this left turn on this crazy street? This is something that Waze does all the time. And like, for example, you're making a trade-off there. But does it know the rules of the road? And when it says it's going to take 20 minutes, does it take 20 minutes, or does it take half an hour, or does it take an hour, or anywhere in between, right? And if I didn't get there on time, does it know why, right? So did it say to me, hey, there's a new accident, it's going to take a little longer? And the recipe is another example. Basically, like, if I follow the steps, if I add the right amount of yeast and do all the good things, does my bread look good, right? Did it work? And then, hey, does it taste good, right? That's an inherent prediction of a recipe, is that the food you're making is worth making. So can we use this kind of framework? Is the world being accurately represented? And is the predictions working in the real world conditions to evaluate any kind of model, not just these ones that we use in our phones, but the ones that we use in our jobs, right? So can we map this to media measurement, right? I just sort of jumped ahead of myself. I think we can. I think there are 4 steps. So the first step is to collect data and build a great representation of the world. In our world in marketing, I just want to go over like my priorities in thinking about what a great representation of the world would be. So the things I really care about are privacy and consumer centricity. So we all know cookies are going away. The walled gardens are continue to build their walls. We need a way to still be consumer centric, to still have an intelligence that thinks about the way a person makes a decision, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to alter the way humans make decisions so they buy our stuff versus other persons. But we have to respect their privacy. So I need a representation of the world that hits that, checks that box. I need scalability and automation. It needs to happen quickly. I need to be able to serve many customers at once, but scalability for me is much more about speed. So how long does it take for a customer to get us new data, to get that data trained, to get it out into the world making decisions? And that automation really helps with that, obviously. And then the recommendations coming out of the model really need to be at all levels of decision making. So from all the way from strategic down to tactical. That means basically that we're not, when we're asking you to try something, we're saying, hey, there's a recommendation, go put it into effect. We're not saying shift 20% of your budget from television to search. It doesn't mean anything. We're saying, hey, use this keyword, right? This one could use a little more money, or hey, maybe this channel isn't quite the right one to reach the audience you want to talk to, right? They should be real practical recommendations. And the user should be able to do this themselves, right? It's great, we can always help. But if you or people who work with you can go into a platform and do all of this work themselves, then you get to learn, right? Because we are controlling the process ourselves and like learning by doing, essentially. So step 1, we still have to collect the data. We still have to build a representation of the world. Second thing we have to do is use optimization to create real world recommendations. So I want to be really clear about what optimization means here. Optimization doesn't just mean, in this context, make something a little bit better, right? So you think Mark Zuckerberg wears the same shirt every day to save time and make less decisions. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about mathematical optimization. So this is something that I learned about in supply chain. So I'm going to use that kind of an example to explain what's going on here. So as an example of an optimization is, let's say I have 10 factories all over the country and one of them needs repairs. So I'm gonna have to turn it off for a week. Well, my customers don't care about that. They still want their orders to be met. So I need some way to decide, how do I reroute these orders across my other 9 factories to still meet my demand? So one of the inputs of this thing, the optimization process, is an actual prediction of that demand. That could be like, well, I'll just use last week's orders, right? Something very simple. Or it could be, a fancy ARIMA time series model that you build. And then I need a schematic of the world, something that tells me about the elements of the world and the rules that connect them. So the elements of the world in this case are factories, where those factories are, how far apart they are, what kinds of capacity exists in each factory, how many workers work there, how much warehouse space there is, everything about the world, these facts. And then the rules. So like, how much are these people being paid, right? What are the speed limits on the roads between these places? How much of my product can I fit in a particular truck? So when I have these 2 things, I can then ask this optimization engine, which is a fancy, software product. Hey, I want to maximize the demand that I'm going to meet in this context of only having 9 factories. And here are the rules I'm facing. So here are my locations. Here are all these things I plugged in. How do I optimally reroute the demand? And then what's great about a situation like this kind of software, is that it allows me to ask questions like, hey, if I allow overtime this week, will I be able to hit more of the demand or no, right? Is the bottleneck in the number of workers, or is it in the capacity of the factories themselves? So by tuning my rules back and forth, I can actually understand, what's going on in the world, where my bottlenecks are, what kind of decisions I can actually make, where my levers are, right? You might think, oh, I should definitely, open up overtime, when in fact the workers are not the problem. It's the fact that there's not enough warehouse space, for example. So very powerful tool, this optimization engine. And we can do this in marketing. So in marketing, we have that kind of prediction level. That's our media impact measurement. That's the machine intelligence that we've been talking about. And we have this schematic of the world. It's our tactics. It's everything that we run out in the world. And it's our budgets. So it's like, I have this much money, you know, generally, but I'm assigning some of it to TV and it's locked in because I bought my upfronts. And hey, my display budget is a little more flexible. And we also know our costs, right? You know, the cost to actually run all these things. So we can actually ask our optimization engine the same question. How do I maximize my revenue given my constraints? Right? What is my optimal set of budget allocations in that context? And what this allows us to do is make a real prediction about what's going to happen in the real world when I actually deploy my media. So we're not predicting in this context how effective this media will be. We're saying how many people will actually buy my product if I make this change, right? The marginal impact of an additional dollar spent or taken away from a particular tactic, which is really, again, the goal, right? It's to drive revenues, to drive sales, not to predict the outcome of the media. Okay, so I have my data. I built my representation of the world. I have my optimization engine, which is going to help me turn that prediction of media impact into a decision that, you know, recommendation for a change in the world that will make me revenue. And then I just have to try it, right? So, you know, you might optionally go in and dig around in the data and try and understand a particular recommendation. You might say like, oh, I don't know why it's telling me to spend more money in display video. And then you look and you say, oh, well, this audience that is, you know, converts really highly loves video. Okay, great. That's interesting to know. But really, just go do it. You know, you start small. You don't have to spend $1 million all at once. But what you should do is start where it's easy. You know, basically follow the recommendation and see what happens, right? You can always do this more next time. And this is this learning by doing. And this is why the scalability and speed of the platform is so vital, because the cycle of learning by doing, the faster it, you know, churns, the more money you can make, the more you can drive revenue. Okay, and then we have to see what happened, right? And we're going back to those original questions. So is the representation of the world reasonable? In this context, it might be saying like, hey, did the CPC, you know, did the costs really pan out? Do my budgets look right? Am I capturing all of my media possible budgets in my modeling and in my prediction? And then, hey, did it actually happen, right? Like you said, I was going to make more money. Did I? So what might that look like? So let's say this recommendation is to say, if you spend $1,000 on this tactic, you'll generate $2,000 in revenue. Sounds great. So you try it, you know, you spend the extra $1,000. And a month or two later, you know, it depends on your cycle of business, you've only gotten $1,800 back. Well, that's off, right? We're off by 10%. If we were doing an A/B test, you know, we're doing confidence intervals, we might not actually say that this is working, right? Say, hey, this prediction was totally wrong. But we made a decision that generated positive ROI, right? That's a good thing, right? And do we need that scientific prediction level of accuracy, or do we say, hey, we made a decision that we learned from that we can do again to continue making this $800? And maybe over time, the whole process gets a little more accurate as we collect more data, or maybe you learn there's like a blind spot in this model where it's going to over predict this particular channel. But either way, you're still doing the right thing, which is generating ROI, and you're not waiting. You're actually out in the world making these changes. And then there's another version where you spent that $1,000 and you didn't get back what you expected. The prediction was wrong. And that's like obviously like I did a bad job or whatever building this thing, but that's okay from your perspective because you've learned that this thing doesn't work very well and you can move on with your life. You don't have to spend forever churning on this validation process. Maybe you give it another chance on a different channel or something, but like I can't hide from this result, right? This version 2 result. And that's, I think, good for the customer. So that's how I would think about my 4 steps, right? We're right back where we started. We are using the learn by doing, the test and learn framework to actually validate the model. And you know, the idea is that the first time you do this, it's for this validation purpose. It's, hey, does this thing work? Is it doing what it's promising me? And in the future, hopefully you're doing it just to learn and to ultimately grow your business with revenue positive decision making. So I want to call a couple of caveats. The first one, obviously some channels make this process easier than others. This is the same as in the A/B testing world. You know, it's harder to do a test and learn framework with something I have to buy 6 months in advance. So obviously in this validation stage, you're probably focusing on channels that are easier to manipulate. And the other thing I would say is that some products make this harder, right? Going back to like cars, where it's a long buy cycle, you know, the recommendation, the revenue is going to come back much more slowly than in something that's like direct to consumer. But what should be clear is the trend, right? You should be able to look at the data and see, hey, we're getting a curve that is approaching the asymptote of what we said was going to happen, right? So that's the kind of way to think about that is if you make $0 in the first period, well, it's probably not going to go to more in the second period. So you can still get a quick read on what's happening. Obviously, caveat 3, this is not cheap, nor is it quick. It's a slower process than we like. It's not like Google Maps, right? Where if I don't like it, I just switch to the next app. And that is where I'm going to kind of like toot the product angle a little bit here, push that side. The product priorities are super critical, right? When you're evaluating these different platforms, because you want to be aligned with the way this group of people sees the future. So if they talk about cookieless future and they have a solution that makes sense for that, well, like that's a great sign, right? That means that they are thinking carefully about the way the world is changing and how their process needs to change. If they are focused on speed of results, that's probably a good thing, right? Because it allows you, the marketer, to get to your decision point more quickly. So I think that's where I think the methodology is probably less important than the plan for meeting the future. And the last thing I'll say is, hey, we're grading our own homework in this case, right? It comes back to us, and we're the ones who are saying it is good. So it's a little bit unfair. However, this is like where the automation piece really comes in. If this framework is truly automated, then we, as the providers of media measurement, have no step where we can go in and like check and game the numbers, right? It all happens automatically. The only human interaction is when the data arrives, the conductor says, okay, free to go, right? And releases the train. And in this context, you, the marketer, are setting up these tests on your own. There's no indication of those tests are happening. And we just hope we get the answer right? We hope we have to do as good of a job as possible. There's never this step where a human is looking at the results and saying, oh, that one should be higher, right? That's the one they're testing. So automation in some ways protects the customer from the the kind of bad incentives that we as the modelers have. So that's one of the things that's nice about a fully automated framework. Okay, so I've kind of talked abstractly, but I'm going to give Imran the floor so he can walk through a live example of how you might do this in our platform. So I'm going to stop sharing and thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Basil. I will pick up on this and help us visualize how this looks like in our platform. So let me just move this cursor out of the way. All right, so step 1, as Basil indicated, is the ingestion of data ranging from media data as well as conversion data. What you want to have is a model that represents, of course, all gets full representation of all of your audiences. In this case, I've selected my primary objective as maximizing sales. When I'm seeing the first model result where we've ingested media impressions as well as total conversions for this 1 month, the model should, of course, be able to decompose it into what is the baseline impact on conversions and separate that from the media-driven incremental impact. We're seeing that in this illustrative dummy data, that this data set has roughly 10% of its conversions are driven by media. And if we unpack that and break it out into what is the contribution by different media types, we're seeing that digital display, direct response TV, and digital video are some of the primary drivers of sales conversions. Now, at this point, the marketer may say, okay, looks like display does really well. Should I spend my next dollar on display? But going back to the point that Basil alluded to is that optimization is not just about spending more money on what has worked in the past. It's about trying to balance multiple trade-offs and see, wait, just because something worked in the past, does that mean it's going to work well in the next cycle? So we want to make sure we run this through an optimization engine, one that factors in things like, well, certainly the impact measurement of the last measurement period, but coupled with CPMs for all the different placements. At the same time, should enable the user to input all the real world conditions. Things like, some things are completely off limits. I can't optimize some budgets, which probably have been bought via the upfront. So when we do that process, we end up with a scenario optimization report, which looks something like this. So what you're seeing here is 2 columns, the initial budget that the marketer may have put in the optimization engine as, okay, real world conditions. Here are my constraints. My max budget is $5 million in these 31 days. And what the optimization engine will do is say, okay, all things remaining constant, same budget, same duration, and same objective, let's find a way to reallocate across different placements to different geographies, to different types of audiences, and say, how can I squeeze more out of this? And that's what this media-driven impact under the optimized plan refers to. Roughly a 9% increase. So great, we have a way to do more with the same amount of budget. But of course, what we want to do is unpack this into, and we also recognize that no advertiser client ever sees this and says, yep, I got my marching orders, let me go ahead and plan my budget. We have to understand this, unpack this, and say, okay, which of these recommendations are truly actionable? So to do that, we'll scroll down to jump into the scenario details section. And this is where the app optimization really shows itself in its full form, because the optimization is really about reallocation. So we certainly have some channels where a divestment is recommended. We have other channels where increased investment is recommended for a host of different conversion level increases. Now, if I pause here and overlay my historical knowledge that digital display has always been the best performing channel for me, how would that recommendation play out in the optimization? It seems like based on this recommendation, we've historically been over-investing in display. And that's why the optimization engine is saying, you're probably not better off spending more money there. So maybe that's a discussion for a different time. My second biggest channel was direct response TV, but I do recognize that sometimes television is caught up in sort of these upfront buys or these commitments where I can't really change things on a monthly cadence. And seemingly any change that's being recommended, the upside I get is quite low. Not really worth testing or really rocking the boat for too few conversions that have been estimated. Which brings us to option 3. Digital video was certainly a strong performer, was number 3 on the list. And it seems like the optimization engine is recommending an increase for a fairly decent amount of returns in terms of number of sales conversions powered by that change. Now, at first look, it may not look very actionable to view it as, okay, digital video, go. So it really helps to add in additional dimensions to slice and dice this data by, whether it's by geography or by platform or tactic. So let's try the tactical lens to see how we can unpack video. I'm going to just filter the search results so I see only video tactics. It looks like if I view the 4 tactics that I have spent money on in the past, it's demo targeting, prospecting, behavioral targeting, and ROS. And it seems like the model is saying that, look, the demo targeting is the best performing tactic. That's where we're being recommended to spend more money to get the maximum returns. Now, let's assume I'm a marketer and I say that does not really align with my intuition, because I'm probably trying to have a campaign which is propelling and trying to do more prospecting to acquire more customers. So at this point, I probably go into step 3, which is really trying to validate this and say, how can I justify this? And can I potentially form a hypothesis that demo targeting is truly more impactful than prospecting? At this stage, I'll try to find ways to dive through my data. In our platform, we like to surface them through a visualization of where the data is coming from, like which location, which type of people, and what journey in their purchase cycle. My personal favorite is audience. So let's pop into the audience tab to see what we can glean from there. So I already filtered the results by digital video. What I'm seeing is a heat map. Think of it as a cross tab, which is saying, okay, when digital video is influencing sales conversions, and if I cross tab that against a combination of different demographic attributes, things like age and customer status, what am I learning here? Let me just go ahead and rerun digital video so we can go back to the screen where we're at. Here we go. And let me add in dimensions like I already added in age, but perhaps customer status is going to be useful for my hypothesis testing. So if you recall, the past screen showed me that the model predicts that it's better for me to do a demographic targeting than prospecting. And perhaps this view, I'm not saying this is the only view, but it could be one of hundreds of reasons why the machine intelligence made a recommendation. And this could certainly help validate, because this is telling me that when I have a sort of a demo targeting framework, my digital video investments work exceedingly well on the audience, which is 50 and above. Let's assume I'm a marketer selling luxury products. Maybe I'm selling boats, which probably over indexes with the 50 plus target audience. Now, that's a good learning because the bluer you are, the most responsive you are from a sales perspective to this specific channel. Now, how do I cross-reference that with my intuition that video should work really well for prospects? So when I view this from a lens of customer status, viewing this by current members or customers compared to prospective customers or members, it looks like the distinction is not as distinct as when viewed from a demo targeting lens. So that could be one reason why, again, one of many reasons why the model is making the prediction. But this is meant to give you some degree of confidence that, okay, there's some level of what I like to call the why behind the buy. Now, if we jump back to our previous screen, which is back to scenario planning. So let's go back and say, okay, at this point, what's our learning here? We're learning that the machine intelligence is predicting and is recommending an increase in demo targeting. We've done our due diligence. We've spoken to our stakeholders and said, okay, looks like this is a test we're doing across demo targeting and prospecting. Now, even though the optimizing software is saying, look, spend something like $500,000, that may be a bit jarring to someone who may not have that big of a test budget. So no worries. You can try this as low as like $10,000 in spend. And let's assume we're spending maybe 10% of this recommendation in market. And the tactic I actually ran this in the month of November. And let's say this particular tactic was in market for, say, about a couple of weeks, maybe even a month, depending on the cycle. And we ran another scenario in the month of December to see how do the actual results of that change manifest in our platform, because we are re-ingesting the actual media exposure for that test. We're also re-ingesting the business outcomes for that test period. And if I were to view this again from a media type lens for the future state, for digital video, I'm seeing that the optimized plan spend that we had was about roughly $40,000. So not as high as the original plan. So it's a small scale test. But I did see a positive impact. I did see that the delta in conversions actually was 20. Even though the original prediction was a 50 for much higher spend, actually did pretty well. If I view this from a pure cost per conversion basis, I actually exceeded my expectations. And let me slice this by tactic to see what is the result of our test about, is it truly better to do demo targeting or is it better to do prospecting? And it seems like our original hypothesis was proven correct. Even though we only spent about 20 grand in demo targeting, that proved to deliver better returns than the other tactics. Now, that certainly is one validation of our test. Now, I will admit that not all tests go the way we plan. There may be times when the test says we didn't do as well as we thought we did in the prediction, but that's fine. I think failure is the best teacher, because what we want to do is, through this continuous test and learn framework, continue generating results that create a virtuous feedback loop back into our machine learning intelligence. So knowing that something does not work is a great input so that the next time the model will increase its accuracy over time, because nobody gets it right the first time around. So long story short, let me recap these steps back in our presentation, which will be my last slide. And closing the loop, again, we'll reiterate, this is all illustrative data. I'm not necessarily endorsing that video is the best channel here. And this is, again, a result of a small scale test. Step one, we ingested data that was representing the world using our consumer choice model. We saw that display, DR, TV, and video were some of the primary drivers of sales conversions. When we ran the optimization, we, of course, saw a whole spectrum of recommendations: spend more in one channel, spend less in the other. But when we went through what can we as a marketing team actually do, we determined that video is most ripe for experimentation, because we are able to make some changes, and the potential returns are actually worth that investment of our time. Step three, we actually did some validation to say, okay, what is the why behind the why? Why are we seeing that demo targeting is showing a better predicted impact than prospecting? And could, looking at things from a audience demographic lens or from a geography lens, can they surface some degree of insights? And in this case, I think we did. We saw some rationale for that decision, which took us to say, okay, let's try a small scale test. In step four, we evaluated this test and saw the actual outcome. And we did see that our original hypothesis was proven right. The demo targeting did indeed yield better results, which exceeded predictions. And all in all, these steps should create as I said, a virtuous cycle, which enables you to learn by doing. This concludes my section. I can jump here and hand it back to either Basil or ANA for the Q&A round.
Sure. Thank you, Imran. Thank you, Basil. We're happy to take questions in the chat box. I know I had I inserted a couple during Basil your session, and because you had briefly talked about the test and learn culture as it relates to certain industry sectors and the buy cycle and the degree in which that may impact the test and learn strategy. So I thought I kind of wanted you to elaborate on that, because you mentioned automobiles and you mentioned direct to consumer and the differential, but what about B2B?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there's two things I would think about in that context. One is like intermediate KPIs also work in this context. The outcome you're looking for does not have to be sales. So if I'm thinking about B2B, you have like white paper opens and email responses and website visits and a meeting. And you can think of everything along your funnel. Your funnel might be 6 months long, right? But every step along your funnel can be something that gets processed by an understanding, an intelligence that thinks this way. And the other thing I would say too is, I don't want to talk too much about methodology, right? But you do want an intelligence that can take a previous KPI as now like a touch in the next KPI in the funnel, right? So how predictive is a white paper open itself of the person going along and scheduling a phone call, right? So you can start to think about which white papers are working the best, right? That's an important question in your longer term funnel. So that's my basic answer is intermediate KPIs and making sure that KPIs can be part of your understanding of the world process.
Well, thank you for that. And I also, you touched upon it when you talked about the fate of cookieless, but this is a very basic question, but when you look at a test and learn culture, is it more optimal to base it on first party data, third party data? Does it really matter, or do you try, again, give a little bit of everything a shot and see where you land?
That's a good question. I think that this is where, again, not to talk too much about methodology, right? That's not the point, but you want to make sure that the people designing this product are thinking about the future in a like a logical way. So I won't speak to what we're doing specifically, but there needs to be a solution. If you want to understand both user level and consumer level and aggregate data simultaneously, you need some way of tying those two things together, and you need a way to control for the fact that you're going to have less and less match rates and resolution into the user level, the consumer level. There are fancy modeling things you can do that help with those processes. But that isn't the marketer's problem, right? The marketer's problem is, can I use this thing to make good decisions, right? So it's like, understand the product roadmap of the people you're working with, make sure that they are implementing stuff that you can quickly find out if it actually works in the real world, because everyone is going to have a really smart person who's going to sit down and tell you why their solution is really great, right? Great, that's not going to help you that much. You have to be able to go in the field and start seeing if hey, does the predictions get worse over the next year, right? That would be a good indicator that whatever solution they're using to deal with cookieless world is not working very well. So that's kind of how I would think about it. You have to stay in this learn by doing framework, but have that in your mind, right? So any machine intelligence is the combination of, or any good decision is the combination of a machine intelligence and a human's judgment, right? And we build, we have long careers, right? We build a lot of intuition and context and history so we can understand what we need to care about. A non-marketing example of this would be, every doctor now, when they see a test result, has a prediction little thing that says, hey, is this cancer or not, right? And it's the doctor's decision using their judgment to say, do I do a biopsy, which is actually a pretty invasive procedure on its own and has high, side effects, right? So the model that in that world, the intelligence in that world is going to say 20%, right? And that doesn't tell you whether or not you should actually do that next test. So that's where we come in, us marketers, and we have to use our judgment and understand how this machine intelligence, is it moving with the world or is it stuck in the past? That's how I would think about that.
Thank you for that. And so I'm just going to redirect for a second. So it goes through the very fundamental point that you started on, is that it's all about driving revenue growth, right? So obviously that is the key indicator to everybody's, CFO, right? Regardless of the hat that you wear. But then how do you interject sort of, test and learn as it relates to creative? Because at the end of the day, the creative is going to have a lot of impact as to, how you get to the revenue growth. So my question in essence is, how do you utilize creative in the test and learn culture?
Sure. Well, your machine intelligence should understand the creative level. I mean, basically, right? So
Right.
it should be making recommendations that hit on, hey, if I deploy two creatives simultaneously, one will work better than the other, and the machine intelligence should give you a signal on that. In essence, right? That's the very sort of glib answer.
Right.
The non-glib answer is like, yeah, it gets tricky. It's hard to juggle all of these things simultaneously, and that's why the optimization engine is so critical, because what it is doing is it's hard to describe. It is not taking just each channel on its own into account, right? It is saying, when I change one channel, what happens to the next channel? So if I change TV, my optimal position in search changes, and that can go all the way down to the creative level. So if this commercial is working better than that commercial, or if they're synergizing in some way, right? That optimization engine, if it's well designed, can do that. It can take into those, the synergistic or dyssynergistic effects into account. So that helps with creative as well.
Great, thanks. I have one more question, and I'm going to read it exactly as it was presented to me because it does make me chuckle. How does the framework help me with novel tactics, new platforms, et cetera? In other words, how does this help me when the next TikTok appears?
Yeah, so it will not tell you when the next TikTok will appear. If it did, I wouldn't be on a beach somewhere, not here, talking to everyone. But this goes back to my product hat, right? This is why, again, automation and scalability are so critical, because it's not that it needs to tell you that TikTok is going to appear. It needs to be the world that you see TikTok and you say, hey, we should try that out. We already have a story over here on Instagram. Let's just drop it on TikTok and see what happens. And you don't want to wait a quarter for the next readout, and you have one little line item in your 100-page PowerPoint presentation that's telling you, oh yeah, that thing did fine. You want to know as quickly as possible, the next time the intelligence leaves the train, how did that do relative to everything else, right? So that's why speed, scalability is so critical. It should be really easy to add in new channels into whatever process you're using, and it should be really fast to give you results. And that way, you can respond as quickly as possible to the world changing in ways that are, unpredictable.